Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It looks like we're ready to begin. To repeat the earlier housekeeping points before I hand over to Andy Robling, everyone has been muted on entry, so please send any questions you have through to the Hays WebEx host, and we will endeavor to answer them at the end of the presentation. And now, without further ado, I hand it over to Andy.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today on our webinar about interviewing best practices. My name is Andy Robling, and I've been with Hays for a little over 25 years. Needless to say, in that time, I've heard the full spectrum of interview stories, from the supremely well-executed ones to the complete nightmares. Mine, of course, have always run smoothly. Well, maybe not all of them. However, it does give me some background in what to look for and also what to avoid. And what to look for and what to avoid is the subject of today's webinar. So, why are we doing this webinar? And I know from talking to HR professionals and line managers that there can sometimes be a disconnect between human resources depth of knowledge around interviews and how to conduct them, and what candidates are experiencing during interviews, particularly with line managers. And sometimes is this disconnect between the experience and the skills of the HR profession and managers who may interview very infrequently. We wanted to give you a guide to support you in your work with line managers to make sure they're taking a consistent approach to interviews and that your organisation will make better hires as a result. If you're a line manager on this webinar, there will be practical takeaways for you as well, and may give you some ideas of what support you could request from your human resources or internal recruitment team in terms of tips for the right questions to ask and how to assess skills and fit. If we have time at the end, I'll answer any questions that are sent in during the webinar. There is a chat function, and feel free to pose questions if thoughts occur to you. Alternatively, we would welcome you also inviting a Hays consultant from your local office to talk either on the phone or to come in to provide advice on any specific issues. So, what is the negative impact that interview mistakes can have? Well, the interview process is how you can make one of the biggest impacts on the future success of your business. Getting it right is vital if you are to determine if a candidate has the skills, the attitude, the aptitude, and the right fit for the team. However, the process, if approached badly, is fraught with danger, and it can have a range of negative outcomes. Firstly, and this list is not exhaustive, there are more impacts that a poor interview can have, but these are just the leading ones that we pull together with our clients. Firstly, the candidate can come away with a bad impression of both the interviewer and also the company. They may not accept a job offer, which means you may miss out on your first choice of candidate. And if your line manager is consistently making these mistakes, you could be leaving a lot of candidates or potentially future employees with a bad impression. In the long term, in some industry, talent pools are very small, and that candidate may choose not to apply to you again later, so you could lose out on that talent, not just immediately, but over the course of their career. Also, getting it wrong, if you do hire but make a bad hire, could be costing your business a lot of money. Poor interview techniques can mean you don't get the information you need to make that informed decision. So you may make an offer to somebody who doesn't have the skills you need, isn't a good fit, or won't stay in the position for very long. Last year, we surveyed Canadian hiring managers, and 79% said making a bad hire cost their company at least $10,000. And 10% of those people surveyed said that it actually cost them more than $100,000, which is quite an incredible figure. But if you think about the amount of time it takes to recruit people, to train them, the investment in onboarding, if you then exit somebody and have to rehire, it's not difficult to see how a bad hire, the cost of that could start ramping up. And each wrong hire costs you money, and if you know that hiring managers are making these mistakes regularly, just consider how the costs can build and multiply. A poor interviewing process can also hurt your company's reputation beyond just the individual candidate's initial reaction, because a bad interview experience can spread by word of mouth, and these days one person's bad experience can also reach a lot of people through social media. Online employer review sites such as Glassdoor now have an interview section that people can look at ahead of any interview they're having with a company. So someone's bad experience in one department can impact the expectations of someone who's interviewing with a completely different manager. Finally, and I know this one is obvious to everyone listening, but you can expose your company to significant legal risk by asking legal questions about things like age, people's background, what their family plans are. But we see this all too often from line managers, even quite senior ones, and that's putting your company at risk. I was actually just last week at a couple of different meetings where both internal recruiters and HR managers had to advise line managers recently after the interview that they've been asking discriminatory questions. And as HR professionals, your role is to protect your company from these risks, but it's part of that is actually identifying the occasions when line managers might be doing this and then taking action to rectify it. So, interview mistakes can have a significantly negative impact, and we just drill down here into the common mistakes that we see on a daily basis, and we're going to look at these in a little bit of detail. The first one is interviewing against an old or out-of-date job description and person specification. And it seems like an obvious thing, but it's just all too easy when someone leaves the company for whatever reason to dust off the old job spec that was written 2 or 3 years earlier and not to check whether it's still fit for purpose. With a lot of jobs changing rapidly, for example, due to new technology, it's more important than ever that you know what the job is and who will actually make the best match for it. Secondly, preparation. We often see interviewers being underprepared. It's a very common thing, but easily fixed. But if line managers don't know what they're looking for from a job description point of view, they're not clear on what they're going to ask, sometimes even haven't read the resume ahead of the interview, they aren't going to get the information they need, and their disorganisation is obvious to the candidate and can present a very poor impression. Just remembering the candidate's name when you meet them is kind of not really enough, but being prepared also means allowing time at the end of the interview for candidates' questions, so that the candidate is getting a complete experience. The next common mistake is failure to communicate with candidates ahead of the interview and giving them a full understanding of what the entire interview process is going to be. How many interviews are there going to be? What testing can they expect? How long will the process take overall? And this is about setting expectations so candidates can bring really their best self to the interview. Uncertainty is not a good thing. It causes anxiety, can cause stress, and you don't necessarily get the best impression of what people are capable of. During the actual interview itself, one of the biggest mistakes is talking too much. Line managers sometimes want to share a lot of information about the role, about the team and the tasks, and these are all important pieces of information for the candidate to have, but you're trying to assess what they can do So encourage managers to ask a question and give them space. And this is something you can easily role play if necessary. Next, and very common with busy managers, some of whom may be recruiting by good old-fashioned gut feel, is that they're not taking accurate enough notes, if they're taking notes at all. Relying on memory is risky, and it often means you hire the person whose personality stood out the most or clicked with that manager. Yes, team fit is important, but there are other aspects that are missed with that approach. When you're interviewing over a number of days or even weeks, you need accurate notes to compare candidates and to be able to make an objective and most likely the right decision. Poor business etiquette. I think this mostly comes from a place of not respecting the candidate's time. It goes around to being prepared, but if managers are late, don't have enough time for the interview, not everyone is present for the interview, that tells the candidate that you don't appreciate their time and effort in being there. And the one mistake that you would have thought that would have been eradicated but comes up time and time again is asking illegal questions. As I said, HR knows better, but do your managers. And our consultants hear this all the time with line managers asking illegal questions around family and in terms of people's background. So, you know, a line manager may know that they can't ask directly about ethnicity, but they don't necessarily realise that asking where someone grew up does expose you to a risk of discrimination. Finally, after the interview, many managers don't offer feedback to candidates. They don't see that if they've rejected someone, that's particularly important. And that's a frustration for recruiters and HR managers who have to deal with that. And some that just don't follow up with unsuccessful candidates at all. It may be in your organisation that role falls directly to you, which is fine, but the responsibility really has to come back to the person who's conducting the interview to take the time to give feedback, to give constructive feedback, and to make sure that there is follow-up. It only takes one adverse comment on Glassdoor, and you might find it difficult attracting people in future. And we have to bear in mind that at the moment we're working in a job market with very low rates of unemployment. Candidates are getting more and more multiple job offers at the moment, which is a shift from a few years ago. And in that environment, it's important that we create as positive a candidate experience as possible in order to make sure that they do accept the job offer if you want to make one at the end of the process. So that's what goes wrong, or that's what happens when it goes wrong. So how do we get it right? Broken this down into 5 steps. Firstly, preparing ahead. Then knowing what to ask, but also thinking about your questioning style. Understanding how and when to probe for more information. And we're also going to touch on the use of assessment centres and testing. And then lastly, interviewing for the right fit. Okay, so we're going to go through these in order and a little bit more detail. So, how can you make sure that managers have a clear plan ahead of time? Well, it really all starts with the job description. As I said before, we often find when working with employers to fill an existing role, the job description is out of date because it's from the last time that that position had to be hired. And that may have only been in the last few months. More likely it's going to be 2 or more years. And your business is most likely to have evolved in that time. And that means that the roles that people are doing now are going to have changed from a few years ago. So reviewing job descriptions against what the new person will actually be doing is critical, but we see time and time again that that actually doesn't happen. Then the person specification, so building on the job description, but also consider what changes have happened not just within the company and the job, but also the team dynamic. What are the growth opportunities in the position now? What are the areas that people can improve in the role? and looking at other aspects to determine the knowledge, experience and skills the ideal candidate would have are all things that may adapt and change over time. And a person specification is as much about someone's ability to fit into a specific team as it is about fitting into the company or ability to do the job in question. And we'll come back to fit and team fit a little bit more later on. Once you've got these pieces, helping the manager to determine behavioural indicators for those desired skills and what questions would get the right information is a very useful support. So if the person needs to be self-motivated and take initiative, what past behaviours are going to indicate that, and what questions will give you the information you need. And finally, it seems so obvious you shouldn't need to say it, but make sure there is sufficient time to review the resumes beforehand. It will help the interview flow. You'll be on the alert for any gaps or inconsistencies, and if you reference points out of the resume without having to pore over an interview, you're more likely to impress the candidate and give them a great impression about you, your team and your company. Secondly, in terms of preparing in advance, so your line managers have done all that work. This needs to get translated into a clear action plan. Line managers need to know themselves what the interview process will be, who will be part of it, and what they want to find out, what the timeline is for interviewing and decision making. So important aspects of executing that plan include communication with both the candidates and internal stakeholders about expectations. As we said before, this is for candidates. This is all about putting them at their ease. Your candidate will be able to do the best if they know today there'll be a 1-hour interview, and then they will have a few days to complete skills testing, for example. It's in the line manager's best interest to put a candidate at ease because they'll get better responses if everyone understands expectations. That's also true internally. If you want to include someone else from the team in the interview, make sure they know when and where and what, if anything, you want them to ask or pay attention to. And then we'll come back to including teams in your interviews later on. Lastly, penultimately, time for questions. Make sure they do leave plenty of time for the candidates to ask questions. It's very easy for interviews to overrun, to run out of time, and not leave an opportunity. You can learn a lot, as you know, from candidates' questions, as much as they're going to learn from the answers. So shortchanging them in terms of time won't actually get the best impression of the candidate, but they're also interviewing you as much as you're interviewing them. And I said, with unemployment at such low levels and multiple job offers, if you haven't given the candidate the opportunity to quiz you, then don't be surprised if they turn down your offer. Finally, they need to have clear next steps. These need to be communicated with the candidate, the line manager and their team, and in some cases HR. When are they going to make a decision? Who is checking references? What testing is happening and when? And this should also include when they plan to give feedback and who will follow up with rejected candidates. Next, we're going to take a little look at questioning style, and specifically looking at comparisons between biographical interview and competency-based interviewing. Now, clearly you'll be familiar with these approaches, but line managers are often much more comfortable with a biographical interviewing style, partly because it's what they've come to expect, and it's what they've experienced themselves. But also a lack of training on competency-based interviews. Neither is objectively right or wrong, and you should really be using a mixture of questioning styles to get the best from the interview. Biographical interviewing is more unconstructed and informal. It does have the advantage of putting people more at their ease. You know, it's the tell me about yourself approach. It can be vague, but the open questions, whilst they may not target more specific pieces of information, can get more information, and the challenge sometimes is actually just getting people to stop talking. It can mean a variable candidate experience and inconsistent candidate assessment once all the interviews are complete. It becomes difficult to make an objective decision. Certainly, it does require less time, so that's often why many line managers skew their interview to more of a biographical style. If we compare this to competency-based interviewing, competency-based interviewing is more structured. The questions are targeted to gather information relevant to the job description and the personal specification, such as, tell me about a time when you've managed a heavy workload. This approach offers a more consistent candidate experience, and at the end you'll have more accurate and consistent scoring, so you can easily see each candidate's strengths and weaknesses. However, it is more time-consuming, it requires additional training, sometimes longer interviews, and additional time to score outcomes. The advantage it does have of greater objectivity can certainly not be underplayed, though. And a consistent combination of biographical and competency-based interviews is probably what's going to get you the best information to make an informed hiring decision. Inconsistency in the questioning process may give you great hiring results one time, but also very ineffective ones another time. And I'm going to go into this in a bit more detail so we look at applying a more consistent approach. So how can you help line managers use competency-based interview techniques in their interviews? Now, pretty much everyone listening to this webinar will know the amount of detail, the amount of depth, the amount of technical knowledge that a great competency-based interview requires. But we can still start with some very simple steps for line managers, and the first step is really just to encourage them to start thinking in terms of the evidence that candidates can provide, not just who the person is, but evidence that they can provide on their aptitude and capability, so that they can actually come to the interview almost with a competency-based viewpoint to start with. It's worth introducing line managers to the STAR technique. So they're looking for situation, task, action, result in a candidate's answers. Again, you could spend days and days training people, and you do need to be careful that a little knowledge can become a dangerous thing. But the principles behind the STAR technique are relatively easy for people to grasp, and whilst there is a certain amount of training required, does provide a great return on investment. You can support this by creating templates of questions for common competencies, structure this by telling them what the questions are probing. So if you were looking at executing a strategic plan, tell me about a time when you implemented a strategic plan or elements of it, what challenges did you face, how did you overcome them, and what was the outcome? And then thinking about the kind of behaviours that you actually want somebody to exhibit. This is going to reduce the time investment for line managers, so it can be the best of both worlds, effective questioning for objective scoring without being as time intensive for each individual line manager. Finally, a genuine competency-based interview will have a scoring system, whether it's 0 to 4 or it's 1 to 10. It has the advantage of being evidence-based. Then at the end of the interview process, you have comparable scoring for all candidates. With these tools, your line manager can get more from each interview, and you've enabled them to make better hiring decisions for both their team and also for the company overall. Another technique that's relatively easy to run through is probing for more information at an interview. Whether you commit to competency-based interviewing or not, the questioning funnel does give a very simple yet effective tool that people can apply to really drill down into someone's experience. Starting with general open-ended questions, gradually getting more specific to gather the best information. So the example here, you might start with an open question about, tell me about your current tasks, what does an average day look like? As the candidate answer, listen for things they may want to know more about, and probing questions might be, so you're responsible for following up on any client calls, how do you fit that into your other tasks? Then a closed question might be as simple as, or do you enjoy that part of the job? And then finally, confirming the information, so you follow up on client calls daily at specific times, you enjoy connecting directly with clients because it makes you, keeps you in touch with their needs. Is that correct? And this is just a very simple way to make sure line managers are getting the most from information from each question and answer. And why this is important is very simply that we're trying through the interview as best we can to assess the truth of a candidate's answers. A Career Builder survey from a couple of years ago showed that 53% of candidates lie on their resume. This is not necessarily a surprise, unfortunately, but probing for more information is important to make sure we're getting an accurate picture of past roles and tasks. And you can help your managers recognise potential red flags on resumes such as large employment gaps, lots of short work periods, and unusual job titles. None of these are necessarily deal breakers, but they are worth probing to find out the reason or get some more background. I also encourage interviewers to ask about employee transitions, why they left a job for another. I mean, somebody could have been in the company for a long time, but it's still useful to understand why they moved on and what their relationship with past employees is like now. That can tell you a lot about their priorities for finding a job currently. Finally, managers may assume that due to a particular job title, the candidate has been responsible for a specific task or has used a particular software. So make sure they are probing these titles and also tasks as well, just to get more information. As I said, I wanted to touch on assessment centres. We could run a whole webinar on this in terms of assessment and testing. There are a lot of options out there, but you don't need all of these for every interview or candidate. And this is where human resources can be an expert advisor, so your managers are using the best tools for each requirement. I recommend setting these up for candidates so they know what to expect. If they know what you're looking for, they'll be more likely to take it seriously and do their best work. But assessment centres can range from high-volume exercises where you're recruiting a lot of the same role, or executive search where you want to put potentially high-paid employees through a much tougher grilling. Also, assessments range from tried and tested presentation and case studies to leading-edge technology. So that might be skills or aptitude tests to measure specific software skills or expert knowledge. You may be giving the candidate a real-world case study or presentation to see how they approach that. Role-playing can be especially useful for sales or customer service because it will demonstrate their communication skills and whether they can think on their feet. Do they have the right instinct? And finally, personality tests may come in and go out of fashion. Some people place more store than other people do, but in the right situation, we believe they can be very useful. We actually use them internally at Hays as one aspect of organisational and team fit. As I said, we could run a whole webinar just on assessment centres. However, the point to emphasise it here is if you're making it part of the screening process, you need to understand what you're trying to assess, but you also need to make sure that people are given plenty of advance warning. We have had experiences of people turning up and leaving interviews with clients because they weren't given the heads up on testing. You need to be considerate of people's time. And as I said, with candidates getting multiple interviews and job offers, if you apply too rigorous a screening where it might not be entirely necessary, people are going to turn down interview requests because they do have a choice to make. So now measuring on to look at fit as a key element of the interview process. For a long time, we've heard that fit is the main reason that people left jobs, and sometimes it's the hardest thing to evaluate what is the right fit. So people have left jobs and employees were let go because they weren't the right fit, and we wanted to quantify that with a survey on fit at work. And we produced a series of reports. If anyone's interested in ordering them, they can go to hays.ca and look at our fit series. And the next few slides are going to highlight some of the key things that came out of it. We found that about half of all employees had hired a candidate that they knew ahead of time was not a good fit for their team or office culture, but they hired them anyway. A whole host of reasons for this in terms of recruiting the best person out of a bad lot, or recruiting under time pressure, or just not taking the time to fully evaluate. But the fact is that that's a significant number of people being hired when the people hiring them knew ahead of time they weren't a good fit, and that had an overwhelmingly negative impact. If we look at the chart on the right-hand side here, the light blue segments are employers who said hiring the wrong fit had a negative outcome. And most of them in that bigger segment said the person no longer worked for them. So if we went back to the earlier point about the cost of making a poor hiring decision, it's easy to see the impact. Overall, 74% said that the person they hired who was a poor fit no longer worked there. So hiring the wrong fit does not result in long-term hires, fairly obvious, so I know. But as we discussed earlier, there's a hefty cost to a bad hire, with 80% saying that it would cost more than $10,000. One-third said it would cost their company $30,000. And as I said, 10% saying the wrong hire or a bad hire has cost them $100,000 or more. So hiring for fit is very important, and it's something that from our survey could almost certainly be done better. We asked companies whether they had a well-defined fit, and what is it that your employees have in common that make them successful? What does your team have in common? Two-thirds of employees we surveyed said they didn't believe that senior management in their business had actually defined the ideal fit. And so therefore it makes it hard to prioritize fit when you're hiring because you don't actually know what you're looking for. It's like having an out-of-date person specification, but for your entire company, or at least for each of the teams within it. Each of the teams within it, sorry. We found from our survey we categorized 4 main types of fit from the responses we had. So what are some of the things that you're looking for when you talk about fit? And these were work ethic, and this isn't just about working long hours. It's talking about the amount of effort they put in when they are working, the amount of focus that people put on the job, the amount of downtime they look for during the course of the day, and so not a simple question of is somebody working 40 hours a week. Social behaviour is about how people interact in different work situations. There can be an element of how they interact with work colleagues in out-of-work situations, but really we're talking about their sociability within a working environment. Conformity is whether people behave largely in the same way, follow processes, or whether actually they are looking to work outside of the norm and are more creative, more innovative. And this will obviously vary from role to role. And then some organisations are more team-focused, while others have a more individual or independent environment. So, as I said, these were the categories that came out from the survey. And if you want more on this, I recommend you look at our Fit Report series. There's a lot more information on determining your ideal fit, both as a team or company leader. As I said, you can order it from Hays.ca. Once you know what you are looking for, how do you find it? We ask people how people currently assess fit, and there's nothing necessarily too surprising in the results. The resume review, the conducting 1 or 2 more interviews is pretty much how most people will go about recruiting. And the amount of time companies spend on interviewing goes up or down depending on the seniority or complexity of the role, and that makes perfect sense. However, at whatever level you're recruiting, taking the time to conduct multiple interviews and also meeting members of the existing team can play a major part in getting the right fit. It's very encouraging that 55% of employers do include team members in interviews, and the feedback in our survey indicated that this actually has one of the biggest impacts on getting the right fit. This is not always possible, should really only be done at the end of an interview process, and it may be that you're just bringing back the one candidate that you want to offer into an environment to meet the team. But it's clear to see that there are benefits from it. Some form of assessment on top of the interview also increases the chances of getting the right fit, as it allows you to gather more evidence, so whether we're talking about psychometric testing, some form of assessment centre. Recruiting the wrong people costs. and it costs a lot. So it's worth investing the time to get it right, even if that does mean multiple interviews or different layers of testing. As I said, there is a balance because you are competing for talent. You need to make decisions quickly, and a long, drawn-out interview process can deter some candidates. At the same time, recruiting the wrong person, as I said, can cost a significant amount of money. So what happens when you get it right? When you've got all those tools available to managers, what outcomes will you get? Well, first and foremost, your first choice candidate is more likely to accept your offer as opposed to someone else's, reducing your time to hire significantly. Your line managers will be making better hiring decisions who are more aligned with both the role and the company, so they'll get better results, and will be much more likely to stay for longer because it's a good fit for both company and the candidate. And this is going to mean overall lower recruitment and hiring costs. Then it'll be a positive experience for all candidates. If you're interviewing them, they're probably still a quality candidate, so even if the person's not right for that job, you're more likely to keep the door open for them for a role that comes down further down the line that's actually the right fit for them. And then, as we discussed, you'll reduce the risk for your organisation, saving you not inconsiderable amounts of time and money. So what can you do to give your managers the tools they need? Well, here's a few ways that we would recommend to interview the process. Firstly, even if you do not have a fully formal competency-based framework and interviewing system, we recommend creating interview templates so your line managers can use them to interview and score candidates. This is potentially going to make it harder for them to ask risky questions or questions that aren't useful. Secondly, conduct regular job description updates. This can happen alongside annual reviews. So as a role evolves, the job description keeps up to date. That'll make it easier to update your person's specification when the time comes to replace that person, whether they move on internally or externally. As you do interviews, keep the questions you ask in a database for common hiring needs, so your managers can mix and match those questions to suit the roles. Whilst this might be a bigger project, determining your organisation and team fit to help facilitate better screening and hiring. As I mentioned, we have a series of reports on fit, recruiting for fit, and there is a worksheet in one of the reports. So drop us a line and let us know if you're interested in it, but as I said, you can go to Hays.ca as well to order a copy of the report. And finally, talk to recruitment consultants about specific job requirements or questions you're not sure of. Your average line manager may do 5 interviews a year, whereas we as a business are doing hundreds or even thousands. So if there's something you want to clarify, talk to us. We've probably already seen that specific situation, and should be able to give you some advice on interview techniques for your line managers as a result. So that's all we have got for today for the webinar. This recording will be sent out to everyone this week, so you can watch it again. We now have time. We've got a couple of minutes. I'm just going to see if there's any questions that we can answer for you while we're here. So just quickly, yeah, we've got a couple of questions. The first one actually relates to testing fit. So somebody asked, well, they said, I'd like to include my team to test fit. When would you do this? Right before an offer or as part of the interview process? So they're meeting more than one candidate. And that's a great question because you're getting the balance between bringing people in too early into the process, which takes up probably unnecessary time, and only bringing in the one candidate right at the end. And I think if you had the opportunity to bring, if you had a couple of people in contention and had the opportunity to meet members of the team, their potential peers, even other hiring line managers at a more senior level in the business, it doesn't actually need to be directly their immediate team, but testing fit for a department might include different teams as well, then I think it's something that you wouldn't do certainly as part of a first screening, but if you were getting to a second or even third interview stage, then the evidence would suggest that that is a way of getting a better result. And then the other question we had about, we got another question about technical testing, and it says right now I'm hiring someone who needs someone with advanced ability in the latest Excel. Everyone claims on their resume that they're good at Excel. What advice would you give? And we see a lot of companies, I've talked to a lot of companies where they will take people's technical skills for granted or assume that because somebody's put it on a resume that it's actually the case. And quite often it is, but all too often people do get caught short. And we have a testing suite here that has almost literally hundreds of tests on if it's Excel, junior, intermediate, or expert Excel. It doesn't take long. Our advice would only be if it was critical to the role, because, again, you do run the risk of testing people when they are tight on time, when they have other choices available to them. But I think our advice is that if it is critical to the role, never take a chance when a technical test is on offer. That was it for the questions. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. As I said, a copy of this webinar will be made available during the following week. If there are any questions, people can email me directly at andy.robling@hayes.com or order a copy of our FIT reports from hayes.ca.